My name is Anupreksha. I am a PhD student at UW-Madison, and today I'm going to talk about a little bit about what I know about impact of pesticides on pollinators. A little bit more about me. I'm originally from India, and all of my family is still in India. But I moved to the United States for college and did really got into plant science and entomology there. I thought still that I would have a career in plant science, so it's fun to talk to master gardeners. But eventually I was like, well, but you really need pollinators to have plants, and slowly made my way into the more insect side of things. And now at UW-Madison, I study bee behavior using rapidly emerging technologies in the field of computer vision. And I'm also a co-coordinator of the Insect Ambassadors Outreach Initiative, which also I'll talk about later. So today we're going to talk a little bit about why pollinators are cool, how pesticides affect them, a little bit about my own research, how we can help or how we can mitigate the impacts of pesticides on pollinators. And then I'm going to talk about the insect ambassadors. And lastly, we'll do questions. So pollinators are quite diverse. The first thing people usually think of when we say pollinators is honeybees. But there's a lot of different kinds of bees, and they're all really cute and fuzzy usually. And there's a lot of other insects that pollinate as well. So here we have a syrphid fly, a hoverfly, a beetle, which, fun fact, beetles were the original pollinators, and a gorgeous, gorgeous butterfly. And then not just insects, but other kinds of animals also pollinate. So here we are seeing some bat pollination, some hummingbird pollination, and even reptile pollination. So what about Wisconsin pollinator diversity? Can anybody tell me, or just, yeah, share in the chat how many bees you think are found in Wisconsin, and also which federally endangered bumblebee species can be found in Wisconsin? Okay, Drew says 400. That's exactly on point. Yeah, so there's about 400 bee species in Wisconsin, and about 20 of them are bumblebees. And then rusty patch bumblebee is the endangered one. That's right. Pollinators are not just biodiverse themselves, but they also support plant biodiversity. So studies estimate that about 87% of all flowering plant species need animal pollination. And so pollination can occur in other ways. Some plants can self-pollinate, some plants can pollinated by abiotic means, so by wind or water and such. But 87% of flowering plant species actually need animal pollination. And other than biodiversity, pollinators are really important. So pollinators are also really important for people. So 87% of all flowering plant species need animal pollination, but out of the crop species, 75% of them do. And 1 in 3 mouthfuls of all the food that we eat depends on animal pollination. And it's not just the number of plants or the number of crops that need pollination, but it also improves the quality of the food that we eat. So here we're seeing some strawberries. On the right, there are 2 that did not receive adequate pollination, and on the left, there is 1 that did. So even in plants that can self-pollinate, and this is also true for soybean, they still benefit with improved yield and improved quality if there is bee pollination. And you'll notice I say nutritional security and not food security. And that's because it's mostly like micronutrient rich plants, so like fruits and vegetables that need pollination. And it's really important to like remember that like rice and wheat don't need pollination, and you could technically survive on that. But if you have micronutrient deficiencies in the population, that can have adverse effect on health. And so yeah, very micronutrient rich foods depend on pollination, and then these are also crops that tend to be like economically very valuable. However, pollinators are undergoing decline worldwide. And so this is just some numbers over there, but a lot of you might have even noticed within your own lifetimes seeing fewer insects around, fewer monarchs, etc. And obviously the rusty patch was only listed as endangered in 2017. So that's a recent population decline as well. And there's a lot of reasons for this, ranging from habitat loss to extreme weather events, global warming, invasive species, but pesticides are definitely implicated as well. What are pesticides? So it's actually a pretty broad term used for any substances that can be used for destroying insects or other organisms that are harmful for cultivated plants or to animals. So obviously, insecticide spray in granules are going to be harmful to insects, including pollinators. Anything that kills insects, like we're making some progress on having toxins be very organism specific, but so far most insecticides are broad spectrum. They're going to harm all insects to some level or the other, not just the ones that we're trying to get rid of. But this is counterintuitive, but even herbicides and fungicides and antibiotics can impact pollinators as well. And so these impacts can be direct, like the toxin itself, even though it's not meant to harm insects, can still harm insects. And there can be indirect impacts in that if a herbicide is killing a bunch of plants and then there's less food resource for pollinators, that can also lead to declines. And herbicides were considered for a long time to be the leading cause of decline for monarchs, actually. And now they've decided that the story is maybe a little bit more complicated than that, but it's definitely a piece of the puzzle. And then even organic formulations can harm pollinators. So just because something is organic or derived from plants, if it's harming pest insects, it might also harm pollinators and other beneficial insects as well. Organic doesn't mean bee safe or pollinator safe. And then there's also pesticides that we use for veterinary and vector control use. So flea collars, tick sprays, mosquito sprays, those are pesticides also. And yeah, can also harm insects. So routes of exposure, how do pollinators and beneficial insects get exposed to pesticides? So you have direct exposure, you're spraying or applying a formulation and a bee directly comes in contact with it. Then you have food where either there's direct contamination of the nectar and pollen and there's residue on the plant, or if there's a seed treatment or soil drench that can get uptaken by plant tissue and get into the nectar, and then the bees can eat that. It can contaminate nest material. So here's a picture of leafcutter bee that's taking some contaminated pesticide-laced leaf back to its nest. And then there can be habitat contamination. So there's a lot of ground nesting and cavity nesting bees that are native to Wisconsin. And so by spraying in our yards, we can contaminate the soil directly. So next, what kind of effects can pesticides have? The important thing here is that dose makes the poison. So at high enough concentrations, many of these pesticides are lethal to bees. But even at concentrations that don't kill pollinators, there can be a lot of sublethal effects. The way a lot of pesticides work, and not all of them, but a lot of them, is they have some sort of effect on the insect nervous system. And so it can impact locomotion, so like movement in bees, their capacity to fly and stuff like that. And it can also affect cognition. So there's a lot of studies on insect learning and memory, and that goes away very fast. And it's very important for pollinators to have cognitive capacity so that in complex landscapes, they can find good floral resources. This is a big one, which is that pesticides interact with other stressors. So, for example, we know that imidacloprid, which is one of the most widely used pesticides in the world, it's a neonicotinoid. It affects bees' thermoregulatory capacity. So, for example, a bee colony might cope just fine with some like extreme temperatures, too hot or too cold. But if it is dosed with low levels of pesticides, that thermoregulatory capacity can come into question. Environmental stressors, both biotic and abiotic, that bees are able to withstand pretty well under normal conditions. Insecticides and other pesticides can make them worse at basically tolerating these stressors. And that's where we're seeing a lot of effects of emerging pesticides. And that's really important because our climate is only getting weirder. And so if there's more extreme weather events, then it's even more important for pollinators to be able to withstand them. And this is also true for biotic stressors, so natural toxins in plants. So plants have a lot of defensive chemicals against herbivores that pollinators are often able to withstand, but pesticides can affect their capacity to do so, and also from protecting themselves against disease. And then lastly, indirect effects of pesticides, which I touched on a little bit earlier, was that if you apply fungicides and antibiotics to take care of plant diseases, that can also get rid of beneficial microbes that help the bees have like a healthy gut, basically. And herbicides are also often broad spectrum. So if there's not a lot of floral diversity in the landscape, then that can affect the nutrition that bees are able to get from the landscape. Yeah, and so I'm going to talk a little bit more about sublethal effects that I looked at in my own research. So the project is called Automating Bumblebee Tracking to Study Sublethal Impacts of Pesticides on Behavior. And basically what we do is we put these little QR codes on bees so that we can look at each individual bee and not have to do that by eye, but have the computer do that. And so in this study, we looked at imidacloprid, which is, again, one of the most widely used insecticides globally. It's a neonicotinoid, which means it's nicotine-like. It acts on the insect nervous system. In high concentrations, it will sort of flood the neurons and kill the bee, but at low concentrations, it can make them act weird. And it's been in use for decades, and it has been known to disrupt flight, nesting, foraging, thermoregulation, etc., lots of behaviors. And so there's a new insecticide on the market called fluopyridiferone. It's only been in use for about a decade, and it's a different chemical class, and it's advertised as being bee safe, except it acts on the same target site. And there are lab-based studies that show very similar effects as imidacloprid of fluopyridiferone as well, but we don't have very many field studies. And so if we know all of these detrimental effects of pesticides, why are they not banned? And part of the reason is that it takes very long for scientific consensus to emerge in some cases. And also, like, the real world is really complicated. If there's an effect on one behavior or another, and the link to long-term population is not established, then that study can be disregarded. And so there's a need really for being able to assess pesticides fast, and also to do it in a field realistic context, which might be more stressful than lab studies. And so in our experiment, we looked simultaneously at nest behavior and foraging activity and flower visitation. And so we put the bees in this artificial arena that we made with a camera on top so that we could watch them as they moved. And as you can see, they have these individual QR codes so that we can, as they move, we can measure their speed, how much they're moving, how much time they're spending on the brood, how much time they're spending feeding, etc. And then the bees were able to enter then exit the nest. And so we monitored that as well. And so we could measure how often any single bee is foraging or leaving the nest. They were able to forage in this constrained hoop house environment. And there we sort of looked at which flowers were being visited so that we could see if the bee preference changed or if total flower visitation changed as well. And very quickly, we found that imidacloprid was suppressing in-nest and foraging activity, which is what we expected. But we also found that flupyridiferone was suppressing off-nest bee speed at these very low concentrations. So yeah, so flupyridiferone is like maybe not that bee safe after all. And we were able to do all of this over like 30 replicates. So like we did that experiment 30 times over the course of just one summer. Yeah, we also want to sort of emphasize that maybe any change in behavior can be considered as like, okay, if this is causing any effect on bees at all, we should be cautious about using this pesticide rather than waiting to see actual real world population declines, which can emerge only decades later. I hope this made some sense. This is my first time sharing my own research project with non-science audience, but yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions. Now, coming back to the bigger picture, somebody asked a question about if birds and animals eat bugs that die by lethal pesticides, do these build up and could hurt the animals? The bigger problem is that there's less food than for birds and insectivorous animals, and that like the lack of food is, I think, the bigger problem. I do think there's evidence for bioaccumulation, so it's not bugs that are dying, but that have some amount of pesticide in the system, and those might actually be easier prey for birds. And so like birds might actually be able, like if an insect is sluggish or has like impaired movement because of pesticide exposure, it makes for easy meal. So I've talked a lot about bees and insect pollinators, but birds pollinate too. In Wisconsin, there's only one, the ruby-throated hummingbird, and it visits flowers only for the nectar, but in that process, it collects some pollen on its beak, and it eats insects for protein. And so birds are also impacted by pesticides directly, so through nectar exposure, through eating insects that have some pesticides in the system, and then also indirectly if there's fewer insects in the environment to eat and if habitat too, so if there's fewer like trees and shrubs and such to nest in. So what can we do to sort of mitigate the impact of pesticides on pollinators? The main thing is to be informed. So thank you all for coming today and engaging me in this presentation. And the second thing is to always research pest control options before applying them. And so I see some great questions in the chat already, and we'll come back to them. One thing that's really important is to like reimagine what a yard needs to look like. And so if we want one that's like a pristine lawn in the first one, that's going to take a lot of chemical inputs. But if we're open to having a little more weeds or pests, heavy air coats on both in our landscapes, that might be better for the environment. For most of us, it's going to be somewhere in the middle. For most of us, it's not going to be complete wilderness. Yeah, if we can tolerate a little more dandelion or whatever, that might be ease some pesticide use. But yeah, obviously it's a very personal preference situation. If somebody's super allergic to dandelion pollen, don't do that. Scouting is really important. So a lot of times gardeners, homeowners will fall into the trap of just following an automatic schedule, or just being like, okay, it's like I planted in so-and-so month, and so now it's time to treat for so-and-so. That's probably not a great idea. So scouting means like going out and looking at what's in your yard or garden. First, checking for, is the pest bad enough to need treatment? And so in agricultural use, they have economic impact thresholds. So that's the threshold at which if you see, so and so many bugs per meter squared, then you should treat. And if the number is lower than that, don't just treat at the first sign of an insect. If there's something undesirable in your garden, is the problem bad enough to need treatment? And then scouting can also help you catch problems early so that it can be treated with some sort of an easier on the environment solution than having to use chemical treatment. And then there's a lot of alternative methods. So home remedies, manual removal, so, getting down dirty on your knees to pull weeds. Home remedies like, so for example, in my house, when I fry something, you can't dump the spent oil down the drain, but you can use it you can pour that boiling hot oil. Does oil boil? I don't think so. Just the hot oil on some weeds that you're trying to get rid of. Home remedies, and I would love for you guys to share your favorite home remedies with the group. Cultural control. So that means removing things in the environment that would allow pests to proliferate. So that means if you typically spray for mosquitoes in your backyard, you should maybe also be thinking about reducing habitat for mosquitoes, so like no standing water. Biological control stands for means using other biological agents. So for example, lady beetles are very good at controlling aphids and some caterpillars. And so those can be bought online. But with lady beetles, you have to be careful to buy the ones that are native and not the Asian or any kind of invasive lady beetle. And then conservation control means basically creating a habitat that allows for natural enemies of, so conservation control is, so if you are, for example, leaving leaf litter on the ground so that, for example, firefly beetle larvae can live in there. Those are very good at actually eating and getting rid of some of the pests that we might otherwise spray for. And so conservation control is just maintaining a healthy habitat, not just for pollinators, but also other beneficial insects that can reduce the pest problem. If chemical control is necessary, I know I already said that organics are also harmful and this is also harmful, but if chemical control is necessary, then we can try to use the less toxic ones. Anything that's repellent is probably safer than something that's like advertised to kill insects. Also use safely. So always read the label. In a lot of pesticide label, it will say like, don't spray directly on flowers, don't spray in windy conditions because that can increase drift. Definitely read the label and do other things that you can to minimize the impact on the environment. And then another one that's zooming out a little bit is, so this is, less in your yard, but civic engagement is really important. So maybe we can advocate at like our city or like local park level to also minimize pesticide use, because a lot of the things that I talked about already are at the individual scale, but like really bees and insects don't follow property boundaries. A lot of these impacts are at the landscape scale. And so improving habitat and the environmental quality at the landscape scale can only be done by banding together with your neighbors or advocating in your city government and such for better pollinator management. And then lastly, I have community science on there. So in Wisconsin, Bumblebee Brigade is one, but there's a lot of other community science projects like monarch larva monitoring, Firefly Atlas, and all of these help scientists study these problems better and be able to identify what the problems are so that we can help and manage pollinators better. And then, as I mentioned earlier, I'm also a co-coordinator of the Insect Ambassadors Outreach Initiative. It is a graduate student-led outreach program that I run with my friend Emily. What we do is that we give presentations to a wide range of audiences, mostly school groups, but it's the whole spectrum. And our goal is to spread insect science and fun with the public. We give a bunch of classroom presentations where we give a presentation sort of like now. And there's also interactive elements where we have some like show and tell live and pinned insects. And then we do a lot of booth presentations. So that can be like a science fair, and we're just sitting in one place and people come by and look at our materials and ask us questions about insects. And so we do this mostly in the Dane County region because we're totally volunteer run, and so we have limited capacity in being able to drive places. But we also do virtual presentations. If you know anybody in Dane County whose group, and so we do like schools, libraries, Girl Scouts, 4-H. If anybody wants us to come talk about insects close to Madison, ideally, you can refer them to us. And if you have a teacher in your life who would like a virtual presentation, we can do those. So I'm happy to do questions now.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And we do have a number of questions. What percentage of pollination is done by bees?
I don't know, and I don't know if there's an overall estimate, but I would imagine it really depends on the specific plant and also sort of the specific context and habitat. So like, for example, there's plants that are super specialist, like Darwin's orchid, which can only be pollinated by Darwin's moth. So, and then it depends on what's in the landscape too. Yeah, I don't think that's a question that's been answered, but I think we're also learning that not that bees are overrated, but that there's actually other insects that play a very big role that are underrated. So mainly hoverflies and wasps are getting a lot of attention these days.
Okay. Does Wisconsin have any semis of bees that kind of show up and then leave? Like, do we depend mostly on the insects in the environment versus trucking in insects?
Yeah, so in Wisconsin, a lot of pollination is, we do use a lot of managed pollinators. So yeah, mainly honeybees, but there's also companies that are starting to sell bumblebee colonies. And so, yeah, in fruit and vegetable production, there's a lot of purchased hives and colonies that are used, but I don't think it's to the scale that California sees it.
Mhm.
Like in California, you have like basically all of the hives from North America come down to this like tiny area for 1 week of almond bloom. So I don't know how much we have hives come in from far away, but there's definitely like cranberry, everybody buys honeybees. I don't know that they're managed year round. I know they're purchased. So it's not just that like the
Oh,
hives are on farm the whole time. I know they have to purchase.
if birds, animals eat bugs that die by lethal pesticides, do those build up and could they hurt the animals?
Probably, I don't know if there's been research on the more contemporary pesticide, but that was obviously the famous thing with DDT, right? That it was killing a lot of bugs or getting into a lot of bugs and then getting accumulated into birds that ate bugs. And so then there were all these bald eagles and very charismatic birds that were having their eggs fail.
Mhm.
So it can happen. I'm not quite familiar with bird literature. So with a lot of pesticides, the active ingredient, the toxin, is harmful. But this question actually gets at something interesting, which is that sometimes it's not that the pesticide toxin that's helpful, but what's being used to make it into droplets or whatever that's helpful. And so I imagine if you're spraying it directly on an insect, it could like weigh down and prevent it from flying or such, but I don't think it's toxic in the long term. But I was actually looking earlier on a Xerces, but I'm gonna find a link and send it to the chat later. Yeah, this is a really good question. I don't know if there's research on like causing genetic problems, but and this hasn't been done in bumblebees, but it has been done in some other insects, is that when you spray a bunch of pesticide and you kill a bunch of insects, and the ones that are remaining are more resistant. And so then if those are the only ones to survive and reproduce, then the new generation of this pest is also going to be resistant. So you can make a pest population genetically resistant to pesticides. Nobody has looked at that in pollinators. That's one of the reasons also for new formulations. It's not just protecting pollinators, but it's also that our pest populations become resistant to the more widely and long used. Yeah, I am not sure what to say to that other than just to have like pesticides that are harming pollinators are also going to harm ladybirds. And I actually just saw a presentation by somebody a few weeks ago who was working in watermelon production, who found that spraying for cucumber beetles was actually worse for this other pest, some mite, I think it was a spider mite, because it was killing the lady beetles in the neighboring areas. It I would imagine it probably impacts other pollinators. Yeah, this one's like tough. Obviously, the vector control ones are tough because you want to be healthy and you don't want your kids to get sick and you don't want your pets to get sick. But yeah, I think the important thing here is to like try not to spray directly on flowers. And yeah, so we didn't use RFID tags. RFID stands for, I think, radio frequency identification. We just used like the QR codes that I was showing you. It was just that printed on basically slightly heavy duty waterproof paper. And then we just stick it on using super glue. And yeah, so it's lighter than an RFID tag. And then we can use computers basically to read the tags. Because the colonies that I used were bought from one of these bumblebee companies. And so those you don't want to release in the wild because sometimes they can have really high pathogen pressure. And so you don't want that getting into the wild bumblebee colonies.
Okay.
So we don't want to release them in the wild even when we're done with the experiment or even after the tags are gone. Bee balm, it's in the name. Then you have goldenrod is great. They love borage if you want something that's like a little more like landscape or like horticulture-y. Yeah, so Asian beetles are like they'll still eat your aphids and such, but they are invasive, they're not native. And so they should be avoided. I don't know if there's been studies on if they have a harmful impact on the environment, but I imagine they probably outcompete native lady beetles. But yeah, I mean, that's the other thing too. Like part of my research like gets at advocating for more holistic risk assessment from the get-go, because a lot of the times even insecticides are only tested on honeybees, and they're only tested to look at are the honeybees dying. And so like the pesticide is already in the environment by the time we learn of all these detrimental effects. And fungicides and herbicides are not tested at all for effects on insects.